Steve Thomas joins the New Zealand Aviation Podcast. Welcome, Steve. Nice to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Paul. Been looking forward to it.
And I got to say, I've met your grandfather, many years ago now, and he was a delightful person to meet and so interesting to interview. And I'm going to find that interview again. It's somewhere in the film library and bring it back and post it up all those years ago. And you must be, like a proud grandson of a man who must have seen incredible change in the flying business. Yeah. Right? Through his life.
That's exactly right, Paul. I mean, the thing I think about when I think of Dave, apart from him being a wonderful grandfather, very kind, generous person, is that he was a true pioneer of New Zealand aviation. He was there very much from the first days, the beginning days, when planes were very simple and mechanical things and very new things, very rare things in New Zealand before the Second World War. He grew up in Wellington and used to bike around Rongotai Airfield and think, wouldn't it be great to be able to be a pilot of one of these things and to go off and have adventures? And that's exactly what he did throughout all of his life. He flew during the Second World War and then became one of those very rare breed of people that got to pilot commercial airliners in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, when New Zealand's air domestic system was just getting established. Post-war with Union Airways for a little while, and then the growth of the National Airways Corporation, or NAC, and then seeing the transition right through from those early piston-engined aircraft like the Lodestar, the Electra, and the DC-3, right up to the Boeing 737 jets, which were another technological marvel for their time.
It's quite a stretch. It's
sadly,
quite an arc, isn't it?
I was just going to say, sadly, I mean, one reason you're talking to me rather than him is that Dave sadly passed away in September 2016 at the right old age of about 90. So
wow.
He lived a very full life and got to see, I guess, the fruits of his work years afterwards through retirement and still keeping an eye on what was going on in the New Zealand aviation scene.
Like so many pilots of that era, the war loomed large, and I guess that would have, had a lot to do with the way they got on and the way they got on in their normal working lives when they returned to civilian service, flying around the country. In this case, for the airline, there would have been a great camaraderie. So, what did he do in the war? And what sort of action was he in? What did he fly?
Well, Dave he turned 18 in October 1942, and I think he was really looking forward to that because he'd been at school. The war had been going on for about 3 years, and he really wanted to get into the Air Force and to fly. And so he joined up as soon as he could. As soon as he turned 18, he left school, and he was sent to Harewood in 1943 and did his training there on the Tiger Moth. And then just sort of gradually actually worked his way up through the ranks in the Air Force at that time. He had his first flight in May 1943, and he used to tell the story about his first flight. First time he went solo around the airfield, he just sang "I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas" at the top of his lungs. He was so excited about his first solo that's what he wanted to do. But rather than going off and joining the fighting in Europe or the Pacific straight away, the Air Force actually made him an instructor. And so he spent several months actually instructing other pilots, only a few months really after he had got his own wings, which I actually think is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Probably because of the demands on people's time and resources. It's just something you probably had to do.
They must have recognised him as a bit of a natural, maybe.
Well, actually, I was looking back at his logbook last year, and I actually noted at the end of his what must have been his basic flying training, they actually said that he had average ability, and I think that was an encouragement to him to become much better than average.
Right.
And that's something that he worked at through the rest of his flying career, and so. He would have been a good instructor, and he kept working towards his goal of being the best pilot that he could be. And so that after the instruction period, was up, and it was time for him to go and learn how to be a fighter pilot and a fighter bomber pilot. He kept developing his talents there. So he did training on P-40 Kitty Hawks at that stage, I think because they probably weren't so much on the front line by that stage of the war. He did his fighter training there, including learning how to do things like deflection shooting. And I've read his memoirs, and he talks a bit about how you had to reach certain score level to be competent.
Mm. Wait on. I got to ask, what is deflection shooting? Is it
sorry.
No, it's okay. But is it as it sounds, or is it what is it exactly?
Well, I'm talking about how you line up the fighter to shoot down something like a bomber. And I think in his book he talked about it. Basically, like you're flying a gun, and you had to make sure that you got the gun lined up so that you could hit the aircraft from a particular angle as you were flying towards it, because both aircraft are moving, obviously, so you've got to know where to shoot so that you increase the chances of you actually hitting the airplane with your machine gun or your cannon. And doing that in a Harvard was actually really tricky because it only had one gun and a gun camera in the other wing. So it was one of the airplanes they trained on to do that. It was quite a feat. And if you were getting scores of, 17%, 25%, 30-something%, you're actually doing reasonably well. That's what he meant by that.
I often think about all that ammo that never hit. I mean, it's a silly thought, but never hit anything, because you hear figures like that, like with bombing raids, that only a relatively small percentage actually ever hit the target, yet they dropped masses of stuff. You can imagine how many rounds just flew into the air and dropped to the ground.
I have the same thoughts about flak.
And flak.
Bombers flying over Germany, all the flak and all the metal and shrapnel and stuff in the air, explosive. It's a lot of gunpowder and resource going up there. So Dave then went up to the Pacific around 1944. He did 2 tours, to answer your question about what action he was involved in. His first tour was up to Guadalcanal and Emerau with 23 Squadron, which I think was a newly formed squadron at the time. And their job was basically to go up and be a nuisance to the Japanese that had been sort of stranded and almost, if not completely, cut off from the main Japanese forces as the Americans were advancing through the islands. And so that's where he began his relationship with the Vought Corsair, which I think was probably ranks as one of his favourite aircraft.
Yeah.
He described it as a super Harvard.
Yeah.
Just because it was so beautiful, so big, so strong, and could do basically anything that he asked of it. A lot of the work he did up there by the end of the war was fighter bombing, and that's actually where he encountered some flak. He had a couple of missions going to straf Japanese emplacements that involved some quite low flying, and some Japanese gunners that were also aiming rather low and fast as well at his Corsair. In fact, he actually told an interesting story about this, that one day on one of these missions he was zooming back towards base at top speed, not very high above the water, and he saw what he thought to be flying fish, and he thought this was quite interesting. But those flying fish just kept appearing in front of the nose of his Corsair, and then he gradually realized, I don't think these are flying fish. I think they're shells, and they're just landing right in front of my airplane because the Japanese firing those shells haven't quite got their targeting right. Going back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
They'd aimed just a little bit too far in front of where they anticipated the airplane to be. So he considered that day quite a lucky escape. Fortunately for us and my family, it didn't get too much more dangerous than that for Dave in the Pacific. Because we were here to tell the tale.
You would be telling the tale. On the Corsair.
No.
Sorry, but I was going to say on the Corsair, I have read and also talked to a few old timers a while back about who flew them as well. They could take a lot of punishment. They could get really heavily shot up and still fly. In fact, one guy I talked to had a round go through one of the cylinders, and it still carried on.
Yep.
No problem.
I believe that. I think the Americans definitely knew how to build big, sturdy fighter aircraft.
I think they were called the Whispering Death. Didn't the Japanese say that they were called?
Yes,
called them?
yes.
Whispering Death.
Yes. So I think he was very happy to be in a Corsair rather than something else. And he was very sad, actually, when he finished the war and having to fly one of these things home on one of the long ferry flights back from the islands into, I think it was at the end of the war, they went into Whenapai, and then eventually they all ended up down at the graveyard.
Yeah, broken up.
Near Hamilton. Yep. Or just left to rot for many years and then broken up. So Dave spent several years in the Pacific, further refining his skills and loving every minute of it, doing around 243 hours, according to his logbook in the Corsair.
Wow.
But at the end of the war, the things actually weren't that certain, and particularly for pilots, because, as you can imagine, there's lots of pilots who now actually don't have jobs to go to. And for someone like my grandfather, flying was all he knew, and flying for the Air Force was the only thing that he had done. He didn't have a career to go back to like other people who had enlisted in the services did. So for him, there was actually quite a bit of uncertainty around late 1945 and into 1946 about what job could he do. And he had to work for a government department for a few months, which he absolutely hated, but had to do to pay the bills and to provide for his lovely new wife, Joni.
Right.
Which he'd named his Corsair after, of course, as all the young men did.
Great.
After their girlfriends or their wives. And so he had a few possibilities. One was to be a flying instructor with one of the Aero clubs, and another was to join Union Airways as a commercial captain, or the other one was to do what he had originally thinking of being doing for the war, and that was to go on I think it was one of these long short service commissions. That's right, that's what they're called, overseas with the RAF. As the story turned out, he managed to get a position on the flight crew with Union Airways, which is probably another feather in his cap, because there are probably even fewer people that have can say they've flown for Union Airways, which is the pre-war cursor to National Airways. And so he flew for them for a few months before it became National Airways Corporation in 1947, when the government legislated all the private airlines out of existed and combined them into National Airways.
Well, now they were starting with a bit of a ragtag bunch of aircraft too. There were de Havillands and Lockheed, I think a couple of Electras and maybe a few Lodestars, and it was sort of like a motley collection.
It was a motley crew, indeed. A modern economist at Air New Zealand would probably have a fit at the number of different aircraft types that NAC were operating in those very first days. And you're right, it was everything from the biplane Domini up to the DC-3, which was considered the most modern aircraft in the fleet at that time. And that eventually became the workhorse from the early 1950s, I think. Around about 1952, maybe 1953, all the NAC operations were standardised on the DC-3, except maybe a few very select services like down the west coast, where you still needed things like Dominis to get around. But Dave's first captaincy was actually of the Domini, flying out of Rongotai. It was only 6 passengers, and I think must have been quite a come down from flying something like a Corsair.
Oh, yeah, think about it.
Zipping along at several hundred miles per hour to going to a biplane Domini over Cook Strait, which probably wasn't, in hindsight, probably wasn't the best aircraft to be operating.
Here's what it would be like.
Here's
what it would be like. It would be like driving one of those old Morris 1100 land crab cars.
Oh, yeah.
Versus some hot American sort of cool, hot rod, that with the roof down and the big steering wheel and the beautiful upholstery.
Yeah, and one day he actually had an incident with an engine where one of the cylinders, I think, shook loose. And fortunately it happened over land, and he was able to turn back and land at Wellington, I think. But if it happened overseas, it might have been a different story. It had been fine all day, but just on that last flight that he was doing for the day, it just happened to have a pretty critical mechanical fault.
Wow. And
there's not much in the way of backup systems in a de Havilland Domini. I imagine it probably would be a very gradual descent.
Yes.
into Cook Strait.
Yes.
was
Yeah.
fully loaded.
I would say that I remember him talking about the Viscount, because I asked him about that. And that was in relation, I think I mentioned it last time in the podcast, but that it always stood out. You know, I was asking him about how the 737 handled in Wellington, because I'm from Wellington, and I used to remember those. We used to go watch them come land on those hellishly windy days, you know. And I asked him how it was, and he said the 737 handled Wellington without any problem at all. He said it was fantastic. But he says, I remember him saying I had a really bad experience coming in one night in a Viscount, though. You know, that's what he said. So...
Yep. Yes. Well, I heard your last podcast, and I heard you make reference to it, so I made sure I actually looked it up in his memoirs to see if he actually talked about that, and fortunately he did.
Oh, great!
So I can give you a wee bit.
Oh,
I can give you a bit more of a blow-by-blow account of that.
Well, let's hear that
landing.
now. I'm really keen to hear that.
Yeah. Well, and there's a bit of history involved in this too, because the navigational aids in those days weren't quite the same as what we have now. So these days, some sort of ILS, instrument landing system approach, is much more standard. But back in the days of the Viscount, they were still using EFL-based radar, and the controller would actually talk you down. It was called precision approach radar. And so that's how Dave was flying the approach on that particular night. It had been a very turbulent day during the day. Winds had been gusting around 60 to 70 knots during the day. So if you can convert that to kilometres per hour, we're talking probably something in excess of 130, maybe up to 150 kilometres per hour or more. And he was flying at night on instruments. So it's not a good mix, really, for landing any sort of aircraft, let alone a commercial aircraft. So they were approaching runway 34, which is the southern runway, landing towards the north. So I presume it was probably one of those very gusty Wellington.
I think he indicated that it was, if my memory serves me.
Yeah. And so they were maintaining glide scope down, heading into a 74 knot wind. He found out later on, not at the time. Perhaps if he'd known that, he wouldn't have actually attempted the approach. But God bless him, he did. He recorded that the airspeed on approach was fluctuating by about 20 to 25 knots in the wind, so they were being buffeted about quite a lot. And the vertical speed was fluctuating by 1,000 feet per minute, which I'm sure you can appreciate is not a particularly safe situation to be in. So that was sort of heading down sort of around 3,000 to 2,000 feet. He managed to get below 1,000 feet, and he said that the winds got even worse from his feeling. And I think he decided at that approach it would probably be wiser to do a missed approach and divert to Palmerston North for the night, and then take the bus back to Wellington. And I think his passengers were quite appreciative of that decision too. Apparently there'd been one other Viscount land slightly earlier than his. I think it might have come in from Christchurch, and they'd had a not quite as bad with the wind, but a similar experience coming through, and they just managed to get visual with the runway, and he thought it was better just to put the thing down, even though it was a bit slick and a bit wet, a bit windy, rather than having to climb out of that very bad turbulence again. So there were a few days like that where it was pretty hairy with the Viscount and anything else really getting into Wellington. Although I do have to say his opinion of the Viscount, a bit like the 737, was that in most conditions that it was designed for, it did the job really, really well. Same with the Friendship as well. They all handled that Wellington weather extremely well, provided it was operated within limits. That was his qualification.
Oh, that's really good.
So there you go.
Yeah, thank you for having
you've been enlightened on that
accurate information.
Episode.
Yeah, the accurate information. Yeah. Fantastic. And I know he did mention that he was impressed with and you mentioned it before we started talking. We'll have that quote from him. He was impressed, wasn't he, with the way the 737 flew?
One thing Dave was very keen on was visual imagery, and he actually recorded his visual impressions of all the aircraft that he flew in his career, right from the Tiger Moth up to the 737. And he had this to say of the 737. And he says, "The picture I see when I think of the 737 is of a beautifully comfortable, streamlined, all-metal, fast and strong silver jet aircraft. That image is quickly followed by that of the view from the pilot's seat when I first taxied out to the end of the runway at Boeing in Seattle for my first takeoff. The 737 was smooth and responsive to anything that was asked of it. I really enjoyed every second spent in the 737. one of my lasting memories of flying that wonderful aircraft is of a particular approach and descent into Wellington Airport. It was not one of those awful days that Wellington can produce, but an absolutely perfect, clear, calm and sparkling day. On our descent north of Cook Strait and passing through about 10,000 feet, I could see all of Wellington and north of Kapiti Coast. I could see all of the Marlborough Sounds, Nelson Blenheim and the Kaikoura Mountains. The sun was shining brightly on the scene, and there was not a cloud in the clear blue sky. It was just the perfect picture to remember as I guided my Silver Bird along the radar trail to touchdown at Wellington Airport. I have many other memories of the 737, but that descent into Wellington on that particular day is the most vivid for me. And I think elsewhere in the book he mentioned that day was the same day that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon.
Wow. That was great. So that was so good to hear that. Thank you. That captures it really well.
On that point, a great thing to note is that Dave was one of the first 8 captains
That's right.
to get the chance to go over to Seattle and be trained by Boeing on the 737. And I mean, not only was that a big opportunity, there was actually a lot at stake for those guys too, because if they didn't pass, then they would actually have to spend, I guess, what was left of their career, most likely on the Viscount, but possibly on the Friendship as well, because they hadn't made that step from turboprop aircraft up to the complexity of the new jet aircraft. And it's worth noting that there were also a few NAC captains, either because they were reaching retirement or because they weren't confident enough that they could handle the jets, that they actually either couldn't take up or had to turn down that opportunity. It was sort of more the captains who were in their 40s or maybe their early 50s that got to do that very important job for the corporation. And there was a lot at stake for the corporation. They had to show that these new jet transports could work and do what was promised of them. And so he took that responsibility very, very seriously.
I went to Moses Lake because I know that Dave went to Moses Lake and trained actually on NAD, the aircraft that we're getting, that very aircraft.
Yep.
Very special plane.
So,
he would have flown that aircraft many times. He probably got his logbook, you can see.
Oh, well, actually, by that era, they seem to have stopped recording in the handwritten logbooks exactly all the hours. But on the 737 overall, I can tell you that he did 2,628 on 737 type. So that would have been between 1968 and 1978.
Yeah.
Most of that, of course, would have been in New Zealand, but some of that will be from the training in the States and also going and training pilots at some of the overseas airlines that NAC had contracts with, like South African Airways and I think FAT in Taiwan at the time.
Okay.
He was doing some training with one of their captains, and a left-hand tyre flew out on one of the main landing gears, and that was an interesting landing, which involved veering off the side of the runway. Yep. So he did all sorts. He delivered ZK BXF, one of the 100 series Friendships in 1961 from Amsterdam back to New Zealand. And also he did a Trans-Pacific delivery flight for one of the subsequent 737s that they bought from PSA.
Okay, NAL or K?
ZK NAK.
Yeah, K.
NAK.
Yeah.
NAK. J was a Boeing original.
That's right.
But
yeah.
K&L,
that was for Aloha, I think. A friend of mine was actually the guy who transferred the money to buy it. Simon Nixon was their accounts guy at the time. And they got that. It was an Aloha, and it was the last non-advanced. And they got it cheap. I think they got it for $1.3 million.
Oh, it's a bit like getting your old stock out of the store, isn't it?
Exactly.
All the new stock
Yeah.
comes in. So one of the interesting jobs that the early pilots have to do, and pilots still get to do this today, is to actually go overseas and deliver an aircraft brand new from the factory to home. And so the first time Dave got to do this was in September 1961. He had to go all the way to Amsterdam to pick up one of the new NAC Fokker Friendships, the 100 series ZK BXF. And I always used to enjoy going out to the airport at Christchurch, and if I saw BXF, I thought, that's the airplane that my granddad delivered all the way from Amsterdam back to New Zealand, 20 plus years ago. And it's still here, and it's still flying around. Finished its days for Mount Cook Airlines, I think, at the very end.
Yeah.
Yep. In Mount Cook colours with the lily.
Yes, I remember that one.
So back in 61, though, they had to do this remarkable trip starting, of course, in Amsterdam, then flying to Rome, on to Athens, Damascus, Bahrain, Karachi in India, Delhi, Calcutta, Bangkok, Saigon, Zamboanga, which I presume is probably in Indonesia, Biak, and then on to Darwin, Cloncurry, Brisbane, Norfolk Island, and then intended destination was Wellington, although I understand with that delivery flight and also with a later one that he did on the 737, the weather was miserable at Wellington, so they had to divert elsewhere at the very end of the trip, having experienced fine weather on all the other legs.
Right.
But that was not just for the territory they covered. That trip was also quite eventful because they kept having problems with the engine fire alarm, which was, well, of course, a little bit disturbing, but also unusual for a brand new airplane that you would have this sort of problem coming up. Of course, there was no fire, and after a bit of investigation with the flight engineer, they found the cause was dampness in the engine fire sensing circuit that connecting plugs at the engine fire wall. So that was just a little niggle. And I think it may have persisted on in some of the Friendship fleet after that, little electrical problems like that. But that was one that occurred on the delivery flight. And he also spoke of this remarkable sight of seeing a dust storm between Damascus and Bahrain. This wasn't your everyday dust storm at the beach kind of storm. He reckoned this extended up to a height of about 6,000 feet.
Correct.
And they could see it clearly because they were cruising at 17,000 feet at the time. So that was a remarkable sight to see on that part of the trip. And then at the very end, he got to actually use some of his skills from way back in the war, doing those long over-water flights with the Corsair. Because in those days, Norfolk Island didn't have distance measuring equipment, nav aids, like all of the other modern airports had by this time. And so to keep track of their track, he had to actually devise a little air plot to work out where they were at different parts of the point. A bit like you would do these days with a GPS and your waypoints, marking where you were supposed to be off based on bearings. So I think he quite enjoyed that because he got to apply his skills that he'd learned from earlier on, like they used to do in the bows and arrows days.
Yeah.
So that was a pretty eventful trip. And then the other delivery flight that he was involved in was bringing one of the latter 737s back all the way across the Pacific Ocean from California. So he and some of the other pilots were involved in bringing ZK NAK back in that was in 1973, September 1973, in fact. And there's a funny story attached to that delivery flight too, which probably isn't very well known because you would have had to be there to see it. But all the top brass at Pacific Southwest Airlines, which was the airline that NAC had bought that 737 from, second hand, they actually turned up at the airport that day to see the NAC crew off, which was a very kind thing to do, so Dave thought. But unfortunately, on the day of departure, rather than getting a direct departure out of the airfield that they were leaving from, they actually had to do a long diversionary climb out of the aerodrome because of, I think, some American fighter jets in the area. But Dave, in his foresight, had planned for the standard departure, but he hadn't counted on the fact that there could be a change to those plans. So he had to quickly redo the departure flight plan and get it logged, which held up everything on the ground. And I think the dignitaries from PSA were left sort of standing around wondering why the 737 wasn't going anywhere. So there were little tricks like that to the trip, besides the navigation and the complexities of taking a short-haul 737 all the way over the Pacific Ocean. Because in those days, the 737 didn't have the legs that it does now, where it can fly for quite long distances over long expanses of water. In those days, they had to fit the high-frequency radio and all the nav aids for those sorts of flights, and also the internal fuel tanks. So they would rip out all the passenger seats and put in these either rubber fuel bladders or big drums, big fuel cans in the cabin to feed into the airplane's fuel system. So that was a big exercise, and Dave had to plan quite hard for that trip ahead of time to make sure it was executed well. and with the winds that you can get over the Pacific too, that can have a big impact on how long your sector actually is. One leg he'd planned to Honolulu, I think from Honolulu to Nandi, it turned out to be about 7 hours rather than 6 hours. So they were very.
That's a long way in that aircraft.
To get right.
Long way.
Yeah, I know. And he actually reflected on that afterwards and thought, I'm actually quite glad I do short haul flying, because I'm not sure I'd enjoy doing these long over water flights day in, day out. At least in the aircraft of the day. It might be a different story these days with the modern aircraft, and where the aircraft can pretty much fly itself from one point to another as long as the autopilot's programmed correctly. But to do a lot of the calculations and the work around fuel and waypoints manually, and to get it done correctly was quite a lot of work.
Wow, it would have been an adventure doing one of those flights. I think they went out of San Diego for PSA, wasn't it? I think they were based there.
That sounds about right, yeah, because they were based on the
Lindbergh
West
Field.
Coast in California.
Lindbergh Field, I think, is the name of the airfield.
Yep.
Well, that's quite.
I should have checked that.
Oh no, it's okay. It's fine.
Yeah.
I've seen a few photos of those aircraft, waiting for NAC to take them. I think they flew them back still in the colours of PSA.
Yeah, so there were pictures in Dave's logbook of NAK and PSA colours, and the distinctive thing about their livery at the time was that it had this black stripe under the nose. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the smile.
Where it looked like the smile, yeah. I think their slogan might have been something like we're the friendly airline, or PSA, fly the friendly airline, or the friendly skies, something to that effect. And it just sort of added to the effect, because I always used to think the 737s with the black nose, it looked a bit like they had a real nose, like a human nose.
Well, I think
the front. It gave them a bit of character.
If you look at some of those photos of those, I don't know which aircraft it is, either of those two. Someone's put a little kiwi on it too. They painted a little kiwi on the. If you look at
on the PSA one.
Yeah, right on the nose, or just under the cockpit windows, a little kiwi. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know who would have done that.
I hadn't noticed that before.
Yeah, if you look hard, I think you'll find it somewhere. It depends on which aircraft, though. I can't remember which exact one of the two it was.
Yeah. Maybe it was the PSA guys, because they seem to have gone some trouble to at least give NAK a good send-off. So perhaps that was part of the ceremony.
I would say that was it. Now,
the handover.
Was Warren Schrader, because I talked to Warren Schrader, he delivered one of those. I don't know if it was NAK or L, but was that with Dave, or was that the other plane? I wonder.
I have a feeling he was with Pete Buck on that one.
Yeah.
Yes, here we go. Yeah, I've got it there. The crew for the trip home was Peter Buck, myself, Jim Walker, and a navigator from Air New Zealand. So there you go. But
he quit or stopped just as the merger was about to happen, because that was 1978.
Yeah, so again, I guess history and circumstances intervened to a degree in his career, because back in those days, pilots actually retired from flying a lot younger than what we're used to today. The age was 55. To keep flying for a little bit longer, they've actually worked quite hard with NAC management before the merger took place to become what I believe is the first simulator captain. His last role was as a chief check and training captain, and so he had a bit of clout, I guess, within the company to arrange this so that he could continue to fly on past that age of 55, but on the ground, just by supervising the training of other 737 captains exclusively in the simulator. But in order to do that, he had to stop flying the actual aircraft earlier so that NAC could guarantee he would be in that position at the time the merger took effect in April 1978.
Right.
So and that was actually a really hard decision for him, because he had to give up flying probably a little bit earlier than he really wanted to, but it then secured several more years of what in effect was flying just like flying in the aeroplane, but being based on the ground. So for the time, it was actually quite an innovative thing to do. Yeah.
And the simulator
was a nice way for him to end his career.
Simulator was based in Christchurch back then, wasn't it?
Yeah, so at that time, the 737 and the Friendship simulators were based in Christchurch, and they stayed in Christchurch until 1983 when they moved to Auckland. And it was at that point that Dave formally retired from Air New Zealand at that point, because he was basically at retirement age by that time. to keep doing what he was doing would have meant moving to Auckland. I think he just saw that as the right time to bow out when that change happened. Of course, the Christchurch operation is a hangover from the NAC days where that was the base for the 737 crews. In a funny roundabout way, I actually owe my own existence to that, because if the Thomas family hadn't moved from Wellington to Christchurch when the 737 operation became based at Christchurch, my father wouldn't have met my mother. So that's my own little special link in the way to the 737 for me, which is also why I'm very, very interested in making sure ZK-NAD gets back to New Zealand, because it's an artefact that has special significance for me because of the links to my family, not just what it represents to New Zealand air transport as well. So I've been gunning for you ever since I heard of the campaign.
Thank you.
A couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, we're
doing whatever I can to support it.
We've got a lot of support now, a lot of people behind the thing. It's taken a while to get to that level, but it was always going to, because you have to have support. But we're in a better position than we were, put it that way, and getting better all the time. I mean, when I say than we were, it was vulnerable. Anything could have happened. But at least it's that's been put on hold. So thank you for your support, and it's great to hear. It's great to hear Dave's story, but it's also good to hear how it fits in. Those were really pioneering days. That change that NAC made to those aircraft, that changed the nation. It did, didn't it? It made the country really small for a start.
Yeah, exactly. It shrunk
big time
travel times. From taking maybe a couple of days to get from one end of the country to another, let alone being able to do a day's business. Basically being able to get between Auckland and Christchurch, or Auckland and Dunedin, back and forth pretty much within a day, and that's nothing to be sneezed at. And Dave's contribution was to help get all those people from one place to another safely. I think that was the thing he prided himself on most, was that he was a safe pilot.
Steve, thank you for sharing all that with us. It's fascinating. It's like, walk down memory lane.
Time capsule.
I was going to say, walk down memory lane's a bit lame. It's way more than that. Yeah, time capsule. That's a great way of putting it. And it was great to hear that. I'm sure our listeners will really enjoy those stories and walking through history like that. And thank you for supporting Bring Our Birds Home. And we really do want to get that aircraft back. I think we're going to have a good shot at it. And it's going to be it's for everyone, but it'll certainly be in the memory of people like Dave and all those guys and everybody involved in making that airline work during that era, which was, for Dave, most of it was the whole stretch, really, wasn't it?
It was, all the way through NAC's history. He flew for the airline, took pride in the airline, and like many people who work for it, it was not just a company, it was a family.
Sure was.
That they were committed to working for, even working in the early days on their days off, to make the thing work on occasion. Can't see that happening today, but that's what happened. Just going to say, hey, I'm looking forward to the day when NAD is back and it's fully restored down in Wanaka. And, it'd be great to be there on the day that it's opened as an attraction.
Wouldn't it be
public.
amazing? Yeah.
Just to remember and honour those days, and again the contribution that Dave and his colleagues made to New Zealand aviation and building our country.
Indeed. And thank you, Steve Thomas, grandson of Dave Thomas, Captain Dave Thomas, one of the first 8 NAC 737 captains from 1968. And I say again, it's in memory of Dave and all the other people that worked with Dave to make that airline work and to make those 737s what they were, changing this nation, shrinking this country, and of course, the only remaining original ZK-NAD, one of the Bring Our Birds Home airframes, sitting in North Carolina, and hopefully not too far away, on display to the public in some form or fully restored. We'll have to wait and see at the Transport and Toy Museum in Wanaka.